This is Mrs. Clark, and I am finishing up our lesson 1.2, flipping Ferraris. We got to do our last two questions here, 14 and 15, just to kind of round out the last part of our lesson. So we're on part 4, which is drawing conclusions. This is very much a criterion B kind of question. So it's asking to complete the table to justify the connection between the original function and the final restricted inverse function. So if you remember, we restricted the domain, and then the inverse was also restricted because of it. And so we're going to look at the domain and the range for the original, and then the domain and range for the inverse. So flip back to your questions where you did that, and let's put in here the interval notation for both of those. So let's see, you answered that in question 4 and again in question 8. So pause the video, do this chart, and then what you're going to do is fill in, you're going to write down here, describe the patterns that you're seeing in how the domain and range are connected. So once you fill in your domain and range, then look for a pattern, describe what you see, and explain why this exists. So pause your video now, take a few minutes to do that, and then come back to see where you were and what I'm saying and how we connect. All right, here's what I got for my domain and range. So take a look at the original function, take a look at the inverse function, pause the video, describe the pattern you see, and explain why it exists. All right, so here's what I noticed. I noticed that the domain of d of s became the range of s of d. So the original function's domain became the range of the inverse function. And kind of the same way, the range of the original function became the domain of the inverse function. So that's what I wrote here. The domain of d of s becomes the range of s of d, and the range of s of d becomes the domain of s of d. Now, why does that happen? Because we've got to explain mathematically why this pattern is happening. So if we remember how inverse and originals are connected is when you're taking the inverse, you're switching the inputs and outputs. So our inputs are our domain. So if I'm switching them, they now become our outputs, which is our range. So that's why those numbers are switching like that. If I have the range, those are my y's or my outputs, and they now become my inputs. So in the inverse, it becomes the domain. So this happens because with an inverse, the inputs and outputs switch. So the domain and range would also switch. Since the domain is the inputs or set of inputs, and the range is the set of outputs. There we go. All right, so that is it for this lesson. We are going to work on our CYU next. I want you to think about some things that maybe showed up in this lesson that we talked about that maybe aren't in your notebook, and add a few notes to your inverse functions page, things that you want to remember from the questions that we went over. Thanks for watching.